Welcome everyone to not only the first meeting this session, but the first ever meeting of the House Postsecondary Education Committee. As I told President Thompson down in the cafeteria a while ago, someday you'll be able to tell your grandchildren you were here this morning. But it is good to have you here. I'm sure everyone's aware that in the House we have split the Education Committee into two separate committees to focus more specifically on the issues of primary and secondary education and on post-secondary education. So it's good to have you here this morning. As far for committee members, I want to point out a few rules for the session. Make sure, I know we've got some freshmen out here. The only people who can present a committee sub to a bill in this committee is one of you. Only members can submit a committee sub. And I would ask that if you do have a committee substitute to a bill that's on the agenda, that you would have that in to staff by 4 p.m. on Monday. Our meetings are Tuesday at 8, so we'd ask any committee subs to be in the staff by 4 p.m. on Monday. I would like to recognize our staff that's going to be working post-secondary education. To my left is Lauren Bush. She's our committee administrator. We've got Landon Holder here to my right. And Josh Collins and Emily Wiley are back there, and they'll be in and out some, I think, but they're also working, and we certainly appreciate them and the work they do to help us get ready. Guest, if you want to speak on the issue this morning, there is a sign-up sheet in the back of the room. Please sign that up. And always remember that additional testimony is at the discretion of the chair based on time restraints and information already presented. For our people who will be testifying at the table, I do in my committees administer an oath, so I'll make sure you're aware of that. There are no signs permitted in committee rooms. At this time, I'd like to recognize our Vice Chair of Post-Secondary Education, Representative Shane Baker. Do you have any comments this morning, Representative Baker?
Thank you, Chairman Tipton. I have much to learn, and I'm as excited to be here as you guys are, so thank you for having me this morning and look forward to it.
Okay. Any of your members have any introductions or comments before we begin? Yes, Representative Doan.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce my intern who's going to be hanging out with me this session, Henry Crawford. If everybody could please welcome him. Thank you.
All right. Henry. Any other members have any introductions at this time? Well, we have no minutes this morning, obviously, so we'll get right down to business. And I'll just briefly explain why I chose this topic this morning. Of course, we don't have any bills referred to the committee yet, but there's been a lot of discussion over the last year or so about the performance-based funding model. And I know we've got some new members, we've got some freshmen on the committee, and maybe some members who aren't as familiar with the model. And I just thought it would be good to have some discussion about the background, how this came about, and how the current model works. So first on our agenda, I have Senator David. Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize. I was ready to go to work, Landon.
I know. We can see he's here, sir.
I'm going to ask Landon to call the roll right now.
Representative Bantha.
Present.
Representative Bratcher.
Present.
Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Decker.
Present.
Representative Doan. Representative Grossel.
Here.
Representative Massaroni. Here. Representative McCool.
Here.
Representative Payne.
Present.
Representative Rourks.
Here.
Representative Stalker.
Present.
Representative Thompson. Representative Truitt.
Here.
Representative Wilner.
Here.
Representative Baker. Here. Chair Tipton.
Chair Tipton's here, so let's applaud our committee for having 100% attendance this morning at an 8 o'clock meeting. I do appreciate you being here this morning. So now we'll get into this important agenda. Senator David Givens, if you'll come to the table, please. Senator Givens, if you will identify yourself for the record, and then I'll administer the oath.
State Senator David Givens, 9th Senate District, Greensboro, Kentucky.
Right, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please proceed, Senator Givens.
Chairman Tipton, thank you. Vice Chair Baker, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And to each of the committee members, thanks for the chance to dive into this issue with you. And congratulations on being on one of the most important committees in the entire General Assembly. When we think about what changes people's lives, education does that. I'm not telling you something you don't know, but one of the neat stories that I heard years ago about education is what happens in that education space is students are able to buy time. When you think about what we are, we're products of our life experiences. And that 2-year or 4-year college experience is one of the most formative times in a young person's life. So thanks for being involved in this committee. I'm here briefly to share a backstory with you about how we arrived at performance-based funding. So we're traveling that journey in the mid-2014, 2015, 2016 period. And we start looking at the budget process of how we allocate funds to post-secondary education in Kentucky, the public post-secondary schools, our comprehensives and our 2 research institutions. How did we go through the budget process of allocating those funds? And it was on what we called an old shares model. Rather simplistic. How much did you get in the last budget as a percentage of the whole? That's how much you get in this budget as a percentage of the whole. A rather nonsensical way to invest the taxpayers' funds. So conversations started, led largely by CPE and the university presidents, along with some push by Governor Bevin, very strong push by Governor Bevin, and some interest in from the legislature about how do we change the model? How do we move from a model that says, here's your slice of the pie regardless of how you're doing, to a model that says, hey, let's help you become better. Let's incent you to do more. And the result is what you're going to be hearing about today, this performance-based funding model. It's built largely around student success. Now, you're going to see on the model in the slide presentation, 40% is charged as being that student success piece. But I'll quietly argue with you that the entire 100% is student success, because every piece that's not labeled student success leads or builds into student success. And the result is that from that 2015-2016 period, when we were funding some institutions at over $10,000 per full-time equivalent, while others were below $4,000. Let me say that again. We had some publicly funded institutions in Kentucky, because we were on this old shares model, that were getting over $10,000 per full-time equivalent. And some, at the same point in time, were getting less than $4,000 of state funding per full-time equivalent. Now, what had happened is those institutions that were below 4,000 had grown rapidly in enrollment. They'd grown in degree production, while the others had suffered some challenges. But again, we were just pushing the money at them all based on how much did you get the last time. So as we moved into this model, we didn't do it overnight. We did it gradually. And I've got to, at this point, pause for just a moment and say the heroes in this effort were the university presidents. The universities and the university presidents were heroes because they walked this walk at a point in time when we provided no additional funding. In fact, we were cutting their budgets and basically reallocating monies to try to level up these full-time equivalent disparities. The model was actually meant to be done with new money, but we hit a tough patch there in the mid 2015, 16, 17, 18 period, and there was no new money for them to do this. And they soldiered on. They soldiered on and did it with style and grace and class. And the result is something that I'm really, really proud of. You're going to see it on some of the slides in just a moment. But one of the beautiful things about this is we have a North Star. You'll hear President Thompson, who's walked this walk so ably, talk about a true north or a North Star or a guiding principle. When we talk about 60 by 30, it is that true north. And what that means is if we can have 60% of our Kentuckians have some sort of post-secondary credential by the year 2030, we'll be at or above the national average. And when we educate our people, what happens is we see incarceration rates go down, we see health outcomes go up, we see quality of life, people feel better about who they are, their earnings are better, and our tax revenues are better. So it's a win-win-win when we can do that. And the beauty of it is we're back on track. Now, when Governor Patton launched his reform in post-secondary education years and years ago, he had a target like this. But the year was 2020, and we were not on track to hit that target. So you'll discover through the presentation today that's going to happen. I'm going to move away here in just a second and stay in the room and listen with you. I'm glad to come back and answer any questions. But you're going to see not only are we on track, we're going to shoot above and land above that 60 by 30 goal. And I'm so proud of the work that you've helped us do. The last thought I'll share with you is you're going to hear a lot of talk about weights. You're going to hear a lot of talk about other pieces to the puzzle is a puzzle. And when you think about a puzzle, all the pieces have to fit, and they all have to fit to form the same finished product. This was very, very carefully negotiated as a whole, and I would encourage you, as you think about a change, make it in the context of the whole. This group comes back every 3 years, our next scheduled time to get together with Chairman Tipton and others. And we're going to have some new members from the Senate side. I'll still be there and be involved because I love the work that's going on here. But I don't have a lot of years left doing this kind of work. And somebody else needs to pick up this ball and keep moving it down the field because it's so important. So in 2026, the group will gather again, university presidents, folks from the General Assembly, policy leaders in the education space, and have this conversation about, in the context of the whole, how do we make changes that benefit all? With that, I applaud you again for being on this committee, and I applaud you for taking up this task. Chairman Tipton, it's an honor to be here in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Givens and I have both worked on the work group the last 2 times. I guess we met an extra time, so the last 3 times we have met. Senator Givens has been on there since the beginning. And when I was first named chair of the Budget Review Subcommittee for post-secondary education, at that time Speaker Hoover came to me and handed me a package of information and said, hey, you're going to carry this bill that Senator Givens has got. So I, like Representative Baker, I had to learn a lot really quick back in that 2017 session. I believe that was Senate Bill 153, if my memory serves correctly, and we have made some changes based on work group recommendations over time. So any members have any questions for Senator Givens while he's at the table? Well, if not, thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you.
And we'll continue to work on this issue. Next on our agenda, we have the representatives from the Council for Post-Secondary Education. So if everyone who's going to be up at the table, please identify yourself for the record, and then I will administer the oath.
Aaron Thompson, the President of the Council.
Travis Powell, Senior Vice President, General Counsel of CPE.
Bill Payne, Vice President of Finance, CPE.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Well, welcome everyone, and President Thompson, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and entire committee. So good to be with you. I'm glad we are the first people on the very first meeting of the agenda. One item I would like to get straight first. I am not the Aaron Thompson that's on this committee, by the way. I mean, but I've known him for a long time, and what a great addition. It's good to be here. Let me pick up a little bit from where Senator Givens left off, and I think it's important. I'm one of the few people that's been engaged in this from the very beginning, even before. It's important to understand exactly, though, what we're trying to do with the performance funding model, as well as some of the other things we do in the state. Let me first of all just say at CPE, it's very clear that we represent the citizens of the state. As the head of higher education, it's our goal to do the things that it takes to help Kentucky really get to that place that we want Kentucky to be. And there's no economy, no good economy, without a highly educated workforce. There's no highly educated workforce without a proper working higher education system. And that's our goal, to make that happen. It takes a variety of inputs to make that happen. The other thing, too, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, that at CPE, we set the public agenda, the strategic agenda that campuses buy into. We set the ceilings on tuition. And if you look at all of the things we do, I mean, the pages go on and on. But the thing we do the most is really coordinate what is good, not just with our higher education folks, but also with citizens, whether it's business and industry, whether it's you. I'm officially the advisor to the legislature. It's all of these things that it takes to make stuff take place. And one of the things in the strategic agenda we look at, for an example, I'll give, there's many, but is affordability. And so what are we trying to do with that? I mean, yes, we've kept the tuition the lowest ever in the history, or at least in the recent 4-decade history of higher ed. We've also, though, cut student debt. So I'll give you an example. 5 years ago, 54% of all the students in college borrowed money. Now it's down to 40%. We've also cut the amount by 35% or 33%. So Kentucky is doing things along those lines. But you're also going to hear today what are the results of all these other items, including performance funding. Senator Gibbons talked about the North Star, and let me just say the North Star just wasn't pulled out of the sky. It really looked at exactly what the workforce needs to look like in 2030 and what it was going to take to make that happen with higher education. That's where we came up with the 60%. Actually, it's 64% needs to, by the way, current data, needs to have a particular post-secondary credential to actually stay engaged in the workforce. You know some of the other outcomes. When you don't have a post-secondary certificate of some sort, you will be the first ones that will be unemployed and harder to get back to work. You will be on Medicaid more. You'll go to prisons more. I keep on going. So those dollars you invest in higher education is a preventative dollar that gets you a return on investment. We just done a new return on investment report. Maybe we can come back and show you that. It's amazing at the outputs. But the other things that I want to talk about goes to that 60 by 30. We just got our latest data back. We're now at 56.2%. And we had COVID in the middle of this, by the way, 56.2%. We now, you probably saw, and we'll talk about it, show you a slide at the end, where Kentucky is number 2 in the nation in completion gains. We're now above the national average. You know, Utah beat us, but, you know, I tell people that those 150 people, they came in with education. But, you know, the idea that we are doing the things that needs to be done to really keep Kentucky moving forward. Our graduation rates are way up. Our retention rates are way up. You know, these are the things that it's going to take to make happen. Our performance funding model surrounds itself with those degrees and certificates that you need to have to move that educational attainment up. A couple other pieces I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to these folks and we'll get into the mechanics of it. As we look at making this better, you also have to understand that there are other things that needs to take place. Toward the 60 by 30, we recognized through some additions, as you well know, Chair, that we had to get adult learners engaged in this. We had to get, we looked at our data, and we're data folk, as you all know, and we looked at our data and looked at the analytics. We were putting 3% toward low income. That just wasn't working, so we increased that to 8%. When we look at our underrepresented populations, we're closing gaps in the state as fast or faster than any other state. Our enrollment, by the way, we set records last year. Looks like we're going to set records again this year. All the inputs that it takes to get us where we need to go happen. You guys started investing in us again in post-secondary, and you did it through the performance funding model, and that's the way we should think about it. However, you know, there's some other things we have to think about as we think about the next edition of this. You know, can we get a little more to the base so we can start paying our faculty and staff more? Because you have to understand, these money don't go to the base. They're used one time and they go back in the pot. So many items I know you all are interested in discussing, so I won't spend any more time of giving you the prelim of this austere group that's going to be with me presenting. So I'm just going to turn it over to Travis now. We'll be happy to answer any questions along the lines you'd like.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. So I'm going to take you all through a little bit of the background of the model. Senator Gibbons did a really nice job of that earlier, but I'll give you a little more information on sort of how this all came about and the process that we've gone in evaluating the model and coming up with changes through the work groups meetings and recommendations. Dr. Payne will go through the mechanics of the model, talk a little bit how the model operates, walk you through those different pieces, and then I'll come in at the end and talk a little bit about performance in the model, how institutions have done, and then Dr. Thompson will wrap us up here. So we'll start off by just talking about why was the model initiated. Again, I won't belabor this. Senator Gibbons talked about this some, but you can see there from the chart the net general fund appropriations per FTE student. And that's not the only way that we look at this, but it is a way to sort of evaluate institutions and compare to what they're getting per student. Obviously, institutions are different sizes. You don't see KSU on that list because it's such a small institution. Their number is pretty large. But what we wanted to do there was develop a model that would move us away from that base plus, base minus model that we were using before that Senator Gibbons mentioned, but also to rectify address some funding disparities that had attained over time. Because again, we saw some really stark differences between our comprehensive universities and what they were receiving. And at the time, we talk about base plus and base minus, but really during that time, it was base minus. I mean, we had received higher education, and all state government, frankly, had received cuts since 2008, 2009. So we were really operating in a deficit model, and this was designed to reallocate funds, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. Go ahead, Bill. So these are actually these are the goals that have always been set for the model, but these are actually the ones listed in statute. I won't read those to you, but this aligns with a lot what Dr. Thompson was saying. You know, there is a reason this model is put in place statutorily, and these are the things that we're trying to look at. Again, improving, closing those achievement gaps, and producing more degrees in those high-wage, high-demand areas. I think it's just good to get perspective on who's involved in this process. There's really three main groups that we like to see and that we talk about here when we discuss how the model operates and how it works and how things get passed and the model that gets created. Of course, the General Assembly, your all's role here is to pass legislation that initially caused the working group to get together to even develop the model which was ultimately adopted in statute. And then go through and make changes to the model as well. This is a continuous improvement model that we have in the performance funding, and we're looking at it every 3 years by statute. And in each instance where the work group has met, there have been changes made to the model. Talked a little bit about the working groups and what they do, and then also CP staff. We are staff to the working group, staff to the General Assembly on this, answering questions. Dr. Payne has run countless funding scenarios on different ways that we can work the model, so stakeholders can look at those and see what the impact might be on their individual campuses. We take that role very seriously and spend a lot of time and effort running scenarios in the model and advising on how it works. The working groups. So we've had 4 meetings of the working group. Those were mentioned earlier. Again, we initially developed the model, and then the next 2 were to evaluate, and then the last one we just had, that was a specific carve-out to define underrepresented students, which replaced the underrepresented minority student metric from this past session. So in the first working group, this is the composition of the working group that was created in House Bill 303, the budget bill from 2016. That's the same working group that was codified in statute. It actually the budget bill charged the group to develop a model for allocating state funds that included enrollment, mission, and performance, and any other components as well. And so what the General Assembly did in 2016 was actually carve out 5% of institutions' budgets, about $43 million, was carved out of the budgets of each institutions, and and the work group was tasked with coming up with a model to reallocate those funds based on a new performance funding model. And actually, that model had to be codified, and the distribution of those funds had to be codified in the next session. So the work group actually didn't get to allocate the funds. The recommendation went to the General Assembly, and then in the 2017 session, performance funding bill was enacted, but also the allocation of that $43 million was also done in 2017. So there was many meetings of this work group, and essentially starting from zero. If you think about the model and what we were trying to come up with, and all these major decision points and many others were made as well, that the work group had to go through. I mean, there were a lot of different ways we could have gone with this model. CPE had actually recommended in years past models that were in addition to the base and just a pure outcomes based and paying institutions for degrees. Those were not accepted by the General Assembly because we were in a model of cutting our bases. But there were a lot of different ways we could go with this. So the type of model was one of the big decisions. We could go with the target and goals method. So, set targets for each institution, and if they met those targets, they could receive the funding. If they didn't, they wouldn't receive the funding. Or an outcomes-based model that considered all the funds of the institutions, which is ultimately what we came up with. Whether to include all universities in one sector. That was one of the major discussions, was do we put research institutions in its own model? Comprehensive universities in its own model. KCTCS institutions, I think it was always understood that they would be in their own model, but that was one of the big decision points, is whether we were going to include all 4-year institutions in one sector or not. The model's main components and overall weight of each component. Again, we were considering all funds of the institution and how to allocate those, not just a pot of new funds to be allocated based on performance, but all the funds of the institution were going to be considered in the model. What types of degrees to include in the model, how to increase outcomes, what type of levers do we want to pull? What are we trying to incentivize institutions to perform better on? What gaps are we trying to close? Not just trying to allocate funds, but also trying to increase behavior in certain areas and get more outcomes in the areas that we saw gaps. And how to treat non-resident students and how to weight those degrees provided by resident and non-resident students was a big discussion as well. Ultimately, the work group came up with the following recommendations here to distribute the resources. Just to look at it at a high level, you can see there that student success portion there and 35%, which has now been increased to 40%, and the course completion percentage has now been reduced to 30. But at the time, it was a 35-35 split. And in that student success area, we looked at items like low-income students, underrepresented minority students, STEM degrees, credit hour progression, so we can count the students and how they progress in their college careers, getting up to that 120 hours and thereabouts and completing their degrees. We also looked at just maintenance and operations. What are you spending? How large is the institution? I mean, there's essentially a proxy for size here to consider in an institution. Institutional support, how much you're spending on student support and instructional services. And just FTE enrollment, again, sort of a proxy of a size of an institution and how much they needed to operate. So you can see that we considered a lot of different factors because, again, we were allocating all the funding to the institutions and running it through the model. In 2020, as COVID was beginning, we had these work group meetings, and there were many discussions on evaluating the progress of the model. But the main item that was to come out of this work group was our 2020-2021 funding floor. So for many years, and I'll show in a later slide, we were actually continuing to implement performance-based funding in a deficit model. So we were cutting the institutions, and a portion of their base of the institutions was going into the model and being redistributed. But moving forward, it was determined by the work group to make a recommendation that every institution's base be held constant from 2020-2021 moving forward, and then new funds could be earned through the model. Now, each year, as Dr. Thompson mentioned, the funds would go back into the model to be redistributed, but we would continue to include money into the performance fund, but each institution could keep their base at the base level from 2020-2021. Now, that assumes we're in a place where we are reinvesting in higher education. If the state were to ever get into the situation where we needed to cut again, that you all would obviously have the ability to do that and cut institutions, but the idea was to maintain a floor for institutions so they would continue to receive what they got in 2020-2021 moving forward at least, and then could earn new funds through the performance model. I won't go through this in detail, but this just gives you an idea of the work that goes into the work group process. It's not one meeting and we have some recommendations and we go home. It's in a continuous review process with several different meetings, lots of data, lots of slides, lots of different outcomes reviewed, lots of materials passed to members. It's a lengthy discussion and a very in-depth process that leads to the changes that are recommended. In 2023, there were 5 changes to the university model that you can see there. That bill, Senate Bill 191, captured all these. Again, we added the premium to low-income students, and I think we would all say we need to do better in that area. We find that when we get low-income students in the pipeline and in our institutions, we are very successful with them, but we are having trouble getting them into college. Our college going rate is not what we want it to be, particularly for those low-income students. So we want to continue to push for those low-income students to get into the model.
And let me add another item, and this is definitely not a statement by a low-income student. I'm a first-generation high school student, so I know it well. But it also takes more work for the wraparound services. It takes more people to do the things they need to do to make it happen. And this is where the money is spent. When you look at overall our campus's increase in quote-unquote those administrative costs, most of those administrative costs are in student services. Those wraparound items they need, tutoring, mentoring, as you well know, I got rid of developmental education 0 credit hours when I came into this position. So also in supplemental instruction that they can take those credit hours and get the help they need in order to be successful. By the way, we went from a 35% success rate there up to about 70-something percent. And this goes to also getting people out earlier along with dual credit. And by the way, we're close to that 4-year degree again. Who would have ever believed, thinking, 6, 7 years ago, we were at 6 years for that 4-year degree. So I just want to let you know, it's just not getting them in. It's what it takes to help them to be successful.
The only thing I'll add to the work group's recommendation here is that, we added a new adult learner metric, so now institutions get a premium for credit hours earned by adult learners. That's another initiative, too. When we review this, in addition to sort of doubling down on our low-income students, we also know we need to get more non-traditional students, those 25 and older folks, back into the pipeline, and wanted to incentivize getting those students back into the system. And as same thing applies here as Dr. Thomas said about the low-income students. We know those adult learners need more wraparound services as well, and so this was to incentivize that. Here's briefly changes to KCTCS model. You'll see some similar things as well. Obviously, we're not as focusing as closely on their model today as we are our university models. There's been more questions about the university model, but to talk a little bit about what we did there, you can see the changes to those metrics and the things that we looked at in their model too, and you can see some similar themes there as well. Senate Bill 191, I've already mentioned. It codified those changes that I've already mentioned and then directed the work group to define underrepresented students as opposed to underrepresented minority students. Go ahead, Bill. The group ended up defining underrepresented students as first-generation college students, which was actually the definition that was adopted for the first year of for this past year's model as directed by the General Assembly. We looked at a lot of different definitions and decided to stick with that first-generation college student. That is a unique individual. They have unique issues separate and apart from those low-income students, and that was another group that needs more wraparound services, and we thought that was and the work group agreed that was a good group to focus on and try to make sure that we make intentional efforts in order to help them to be more successful. The 3% that was allocated to underrepresented minority students, we would allocate that whole 3% to these underrepresented students and the first-generation college students. And we would apply differential sector weighting to the first-generation metric at a midpoint between no weights and full weights between the research and comprehensive universities. And Dr. Payne is going to talk a little bit more in depth about how weighting works and explain that in more depth here shortly. Similarly, for the KCTCS model, you can see what we did there as well. They're using the first-generation college student metric just as the 4-year institutions for their underrepresented students. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Payne.
Does anyone have any questions for Travis Powell at this point before we move on?
We do have some members have some questions. Representative Massaroni.
Thank you. Looking at the metrics in the model, it seems only one is Kentucky specific. Does that allow the larger universities to gain more from the out-of-state recruitment? Or is it, does it hurt
You said
smaller?
that only one metric?
It only looks like one of the 6 is actually Kentucky specific. So is that allowing the larger universities to kind of game the system? Just out of curiosity.
And are you speaking about the 5 components here?
Yes.
Are you talking about Kentucky alone?
Yes.
Specific, not
Kentucky
specific. I got you.
Well, all of the metrics are specific to Kentucky residents. There is a weighting in the earned credit hour component for non-resident students, and they were weighted at 50% of what an earned credit hour would be for an in-state student. That was recently increased to 75% weighting. So if an in-state student attending a bachelor's degree English course had a weighting of 1, the weighting for a non-resident student attending that same class would now be 0.75. And so we did emphasize in that course completion component a heavier weighting for in-state students, but at the same time, we're trying to encourage out-of-state students to attend Kentucky institutions. Many of those students, as you already know, once they complete their degrees at a Kentucky institution, they remain in state and live and work in Kentucky, which is a big benefit for the state because you don't have to pay their K-12 education expenses when they're coming from another state. All of the other metrics, the degree metrics and the progression metrics, they apply to students regardless of whether you're in state or out of state. So that's the answer to your question.
Okay.
Well, a more specific answer is, though, we have a significant amount of out-of-state students at Murray State, Western, and Northern. So
it seems to me
yeah.
that we're incentivizing more out-of-state than in-state students. Is that?
Well, no, you're incentivizing more in-state students because
Okay.
you get 1-to-1. You get 0.75 for an out-of-state student. So you're incentivizing more. The methodology used in this, by the way, is that what you're trying to do, if you look at the inputs, and not just that out-of-state students normally pay full tuition, whereas you have a much larger discount for in-state students. That's number one. Number two, you also have the paradigm of trying to get at least 40% of the students that come out of state to stay in state and work in Kentucky, so the return on investment. And for us to literally get to 60 by 30, we have to keep more out-of-state students in state. The third thing I think is important is that this just wasn't a large institution that actually brought this metric to the work group. It was actually one of the comprehensives that really brought it to the work group. Now, does UK have a larger percentage of out-of-state students than the other institutions? No doubt. So, but you're not incentivizing out-of-state students more than you are in-state. If you look at, once again, if you look at tuition paid, and if you look at truly some of the other pieces, 0.75 versus 1.0, and it was only in this year that it went 0.75, by the way. Before that it was 0.50. So the working group actually voted to increase the weighting for out-of-state students. And a part of it is much more long explanation that you asked for, that we have less than a 50% college going rate of traditional age population that's going to a Kentucky school. So for us, if we only counted on that, plus you have a declining high school, folks in high school in addition to a lower college going rate, we have to have out-of-state students truly to, quote unquote, get us where we need to go.
Well, and one last consideration, for about 6 or 7 years there, most of our institutions were experiencing declining enrollment, and as President Thompson said, we also had a declining college participation rate, and so they had capacity to take on additional students. So no in-state students have been turned away because of the enrollment, trying to increase the enrollment of out-of-state students. And as we said earlier, when those students stay in Kentucky and live and work post-graduation, it is a real benefit for the state. Just briefly, I'm going to try to stay at a 10,000-foot level and explain the mechanics of the funding model. The first step in running the model is to calculate what we call allocable resources that will be assigned to each institution. And the allocable resources are actually the funds for each institution and in total for the university sector, which will be run through the funding model. And you can see the formula there for calculating allocable resources. You start with each institution's general fund appropriation. You back out debt service and mandated program funds because those are restricted dollars that aren't used for educating students. And then you back out a small school adjustment. And that's how you calculate the allocable resources.
Bill, can you give an example of a mandated program?
A mandated program would be the Breathitt Veterinary Center, for example, at Murray State University. Yeah. And these are public service and research-related activities, that are conducted at our universities and at KCTCS that are not instruction-related. The funding for those programs is line item in the budget bill, and UK has the largest number and largest dollar amount of mandated programs because of their land grant function. Just quickly, the small school adjustment is a fixed amount of operating funds that is set aside for each institution that is not run through the funding model, and that was that was intended to help smaller institutions like KSU and Moorhead to be able to compete in the funding model with the larger institutions. The second step in running the model is to allocate the allocable resources to component funding pools. And I'm going to start at the bottom of this slide. If you look at the total allocable resources back in 2018-19, it was about $520 million that got run through the university funding model. And what you do is you divide that $520 million between the 5 major model components. You can see student success and course completion in 2019 were both 35% of the total allocation. M&O, institutional support, and academic support were 10% each. And so basically you're taking that full $520 million and you're allocating it to those specific component funding pools. And I'm going to just dive in a little bit deeper and look just at the student success funding pool, which was $182 million in 2018-19. And this slide shows the next step in running the model, which is to allocate funding to metric pools. You can see the student success metrics listed on the left-hand side of this slide, as Travis Powell indicated. You've got student progression at the 30 credit hour, 60 credit hour, and 90 credit hour level. You've got 4 different kinds of bachelor's degrees. All bachelor's degrees, STEM plus H bachelor's degrees, underrepresented minority bachelor's degrees, and then low-income bachelor's degrees. And highlighted in the green box, you can see the allocation percentages applied to each one of those metrics. And you're taking that $182 million and you're allocating it to those metric pools. The next thing I want to point out is the bachelor's degree metric with an allocation percentage of 9%, $46.8 million. Here you can see that $46.8 million is being distributed among the universities based on their share of bachelor's degrees produced. So if you take each institution's bachelor's degrees awarded, divided by the university total bachelor's degrees awarded, you get a percentage share. You multiply that percent times the size of the pool. And so the funding is being distributed based on what the institutions are
Dr. Payne,
actually producing. Yes.
quick question. Aren't those bachelor degree components stackable? If a student is in more than one, so you could have a student
Yes.
who is a STEM H degree, underrepresented, and low income, and all those weights would stack. Correct?
Yes, the premiums are cumulative. So you get credit as an institution for awarding a bachelor's degree. If that bachelor's degree is awarded in a STEM plus H field, you get an additional amount of funding that's associated with that. And if that degree is also awarded to a low-income student, you get even additional funding awarded for that reason. So yes, it is stackable. Thank you for bringing that up.
Which is one of the ways you close gaps, as an example, by the way, because it takes more effort and money, honestly, as you go through. We know, my child is a STEM H person, right? And the amount of work he puts in, the amount of time it takes is significantly longer in most cases than some of the other degrees.
Here are the final 3 steps in running the university funding model. Step 5, you sum all of those metric pool distributions to determine a formula total for each institution. You can see the definition there of the formula total. It is the amount of funding the model calculates an institution should have based on its share of outcomes produced. In step 6, the model then looks at the difference between the amount of funding an institution actually has, which are its allocable resources, and the amount of funding the model determines it should have based on outcomes produced, which is the formula total. And then in step 7, the model distributes whatever dollars have been appropriated to the performance fund to try to rectify those identified funding differences across institutions. So that's a very quick.
And Bill, what happens? Sorry, if just explain a little bit on that final step. If the model says the institution has more than it's supposed to have.
If there's an institution where the model indicates that they've actually already have more funding than their level of degree production or student progression would dictate, those dollars are held in a hold harmless account for that institution, and they get to retain those dollars in their base. Because of the actions of the 2020 working group and that 2020-21 funding floor and the elimination of the stop loss provisions, those dollars do not get redistributed to other institutions. That institution gets to keep those dollars as part of their base funding. There's been a lot of discussion and a couple of articles in the press about the weightings between sectors. And this came up as part of the 2024 working group discussions about whether or not to weight that first generation college student metric. And so I thought it might be helpful just to provide a little bit of background information about the weightings and how they're calculated and what was the rationale for those weightings when they were adopted by the 2016 working group. The first thing I want to do is remind you that the House Bill 303 charged that 2016 working group to develop a model for allocating state funds that included elements of enrollment, mission, and performance. And that mission component is very important. So among the major decisions that working group had to make was whether or not to include the research and comprehensive universities in the same funding pool or assign them to different separate funding pools. Once the decision was made to include all the universities in one pool, the companion question was, how do you account for cost and mission differences between the two university sectors within the university model? And the answer that the working group came up with in 2016 was to adopt differential metric weights by sector. And the working group was unanimous on this point. The chair of the working group, Gary Ransdale from Western Kentucky University, at about our third meeting of that 2016 working group, basically said that he was on board with including the comprehensive universities and the research universities in one funding pool, but that the first year that you run the model, there should be no shifting of funds from the research sector to the comprehensive sector or vice versa. And so what these weightings do is that they ensure that there's funding parity the first time that you run, or they maintain funding parity that first year that you actually run the performance funding model. The weights that are shown to the right here have been defined in regulations and will be applied in 2025-26. I've highlighted in yellow the first generation bachelor's degree metric, which replaced the underrepresented minority student bachelor's degree metric, and that 1.67 weighting for the research institutions is that half weighting for that particular metric, which is what the working group in 2024 voted to do in terms of applying the weighting for that metric. So here was the rationale of that 2016 working group. The weightings account for the cost and mission differences between the research and comprehensive sectors. They compensate for the exclusion of a couple of mission-related metrics that are specific for the research institutions. One of those was the exclusion of a graduate degree metric that would reward growth in master's and doctoral degrees. And just as an example, in 2023-24, the University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville combined awarded 80% of the doctoral degrees in that academic year. It was also to compensate for the exclusion of a research metric that would reward growth in research dollars generated. As you looked around the country in 2016 at funding models in other states, a lot of them had a research metric to incentivize the production of extramural research dollars. There was no such research metric included in the Kentucky performance funding model, and that was one of the reasons that weighting was adopted by that 2016 working group. And just to provide some perspective, in 2023-24, over 95% of both federal and total research and development dollars awarded in Kentucky were awarded to the two research institutions, UK and U of L. Lastly, we wanted to calibrate the metrics, as I mentioned earlier, to maintain funding parity between the two sectors in the first year of implementation. I think most of you already know that research and comprehensive universities differ in terms of their basic missions and their faculty roles and responsibilities. Research universities focus more on research activities and graduate education. Their faculty are expected to engage in research alongside teaching. UK and U of L have to compete in a national, if not international, market for faculty talent. And they have to pay those faculty more because the expectation is that they either already have active research agendas and they'll bring those federal research dollars to Kentucky with them when they relocate, or that they'll develop active research agendas. The comprehensive universities focus more on undergraduate teaching and student learning, and their faculty are centered more on teaching and mentoring students. Was there a question? Okay. Lastly, the weighting between the sectors was adopted in order to maintain parity between the two sectors in the first year of implementation. And this table to the right is a little bit detailed, and I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail. But basically, you take the allocable resources for each institution, you identify the contribution percentage, and this is for the academic support metric, and this was back in June of 2017. So you apply that 10% to the allocable resources for each institution to get a contributed dollar amount. You total that by sector. You divide it by the number of FTE students in this case by sector, and you get a sector subsidy A for the research sector, which was a little over $598 per student. And then you get a sector subsidy for the comprehensive sector, which was $445. You divide one by the other, and that's how you calculate the weight factor. So the weight factor for the research sector is 1.34, and the weight factor for the comprehensive institutions is 1. After year 1, this is an important point, that second bullet, institutions could increase their share of funding for a given metric by achieving growth rates above the sector average, and I'm going to go into that in a little more detail in just a minute. But funds could also begin to move between the sectors after that first year. So this calibration of the metrics was intended just to maintain that funding parity in that first year of implementation. And just to give you some sense of the magnitude of the cost differential, absent those differential weights, in 2018-19, the model would have called for a $28.6 million shift in funding immediately in year 1 from the research sector to the comprehensive sector. And we would have never gotten consensus among all of the presidents if funding had shifted in one direction or the other in that first year of the model's implementation. Just quickly, I'm going to go over the fiscal impact. This table shows the implementation schedule and the funding sources for performance funding during the 8 years that it's been in operation. As Senator Givens already alluded to, during those first 4 years, the General Assembly was dealing with some budget issues, and there was no new funding that was applied to the performance funding model. If you look at the table, you can see that institution contribution column. That $42.9 million was that 5% carve-out that Travis just spoke about. For the next 3 years, those dollars were all carved out of the institutional-based budgets and redistributed. And so what was happening during those first 4 years, you were essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul. You were carving dollars out of the base budgets of every institution and then redistributing that base among the institutions. In March 2021, KRS 164092 was amended to eliminate the stop-loss provisions and to establish that funding floor 2021. Also at that time, beginning in 21-22, the General Assembly began appropriating new operating funds to the Performance Fund. And so you can see highlighted in yellow, in years 4 through 7, the institution contribution has gone to 0, and all of the dollars that have been distributed out of the Performance Fund have come from appropriations that the General Assembly has provided. and CPE and the institutions thank the General Assembly very much for those appropriations. Just quickly, the unit of measure that CPE uses to make funding comparisons and to track trends in funding over time is called State Funds for Educating Students. It's each institution's general fund appropriation minus debt service and mandated program funds, plus that institution's performance fund distribution in any given year. This slide shows a tale of two time periods. The table on the left shows the change in state funds for educating students between 2017 and 2021, which was the first 4 years where there was no new state funding coming into the system. And as you can see over that time period, only 3 institutions had positive dollar and percent changes, UK, Northern, and Western. I've highlighted those percent changes in yellow. But 6 of our 9 institutions had negative dollar and percent changes over that time period. If you look at the table to the right, this is the 4-year period from 2021 through 2025, and it looks at the change in state funds for educating students between those 2 years. You can see that the dollar change and the percent change is positive all across the board. That's because of the removal of the stop-loss provisions, the adoption of the funding floor, and those the infusion of new dollars. As you can see, the largest percent increase was at Northern. They had about a 30% change over that 4-year period. Largest dollar increase was at UK, just under 46 million. U of L and KCTCS, their percent increases were right at the system average. Lastly, in terms of fiscal impact, this chart shows the amount of state funding per FTE at every university in 2017 and in 2024. The blue bars represent the amount of state funds per student in fiscal year 2016-17, and the red bars is the amount of state funds per student in fiscal year 23-24. As you can see in the chart, the funding disparities within the comprehensive sector have lessened over time. Between 2017 and 2024, the gap in funding between Moorhead and Northern has decreased from over $1,300 per student down to where the difference is only $62 per student. Lastly, in 2025, funding parity was achieved at 7 out of 8 institutions. One other thing I'll point out about this chart, every university shown there, with the exception of KSU, has recorded an increase in their funding per FTE over this period. The smallest dollar increase was at UK. They had a $664 per student increase. The smallest percentage increase was at U of L. They had a 10.4% increase. The largest dollar and percent increases were at Northern and Western. Northern had over a $2,000 increase in their per student funding. Western, $1,241 per student increase. Northern's increase was 53% over this time period, and Western's was 30%. So those 2 comprehensive institutions, Northern and Western, saw the largest dollar increases and the largest percent increases over this time period.
Dr. Payne, if I may.
Yes.
You mentioned that the small school adjustment.
All questions go through the chair. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Okay.
Okay, are we going to hold until the end for the questions? Okay. We felt like it was important for this committee to understand what are the determinants of that performance funding distribution. And the real key is, for any given metric, did you achieve a growth rate and activity volume for that metric above the sector average? And the more metrics for which an institution achieves above average growth rates, the better its chance of increasing its overall share of funding. And there's 11 total metrics. And one way that the council staff tracks this is through what we call the metric scorecard. And that's the chart that you see to the right. What this is showing, for every performance funding metric, and you see the 11 metrics listed down the left-hand side of the chart, and for every institution, for which metrics did an institution achieve growth rates that exceeded the sector average? And if an institution achieved growth rates above the sector average for a given metric, it's shown by a check mark and surrounded with some green highlighting. And as you can see, between 2023 and 2024, University of Kentucky was 9 out of 11 in terms of their metrics where they exceeded the average growth rate. U of L was 7 out of 11. Murray and Northern were 6 out of 11 each. But that last bullet on the previous page was actually a pretty important bullet. The magnitude of your growth above the average and the size of the funding pool matters. And that's what I've highlighted in yellow here are two funding pools, the earned credit hour pool, and if you look to the far right, you can see the pool size is over $208 million. The FTE student pool is also highlighted. That's about a $60 million pool. So combined in that year, the earned credit hour and FTE student funding pools accounted for 45% of the total allocable resources that were run through the funding model. And if you look at the three institutions that did well in terms of the earned credit hour metric and FTE students, UK, U of L, and Northern were above average on earned credit hours. UK, U of L, KSU, Murray, and Northern were above average on FTE students. So there is a direct relationship, if you look now to the table on the left, between the number of metrics with growth rates above the sector average and funding. And so if you look at the change in performance fund distributions between 2023 and 2024, and we selected that time period because if you look at the bottom of those first two columns of numbers, in both years, 97.3 million was distributed. So the difference in those 2 years is driven solely by performance, and it's driven by what you see in that metric scorecard. This chart shows the number of metrics at each university with growth rates above the sector average between 2019 and 2025. As you can see by looking at the chart, UK, U of L, and Northern had more growth rates with above average growth in more years than any of the other institutions. These are the same institutions that increased or at least maintained their share of funding over this time period. I think it's really worth noting that metric counts at Murray and KSU are trending upward. So we're seeing a very positive trend for those two institutions just in the past 3-4 years. Lastly, this chart shows the change in the share of state funds for educating students. And this is between 2017 and 2025. And as you can see over this time period, only two institutions actually increased their share of state funds. That was UK with a 2 percentage point increase from 23.9% up to 25.9%, and Northern Kentucky University from 5.9% up to 7.4%. The largest decreases occurred at Morehead, who lost a 1 percentage point share of their state funding, and then Eastern and U of L both had a minus 0.6 percentage point decline in their share. One important takeaway from this slide is that the annual changes over time have been gradual, and that was one of the objectives, actually one of the principles of the 2016 working group, was that shifts in funding needed to be gradual or incremental over time. At this time, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to Travis Powell.
Tom's going to take these.
Oh, okay. I'm going to turn it over to President Thompson to share some information about student outcomes.
You know, most of it I've already shared, but I'm proud to say that Kentucky is one of the leading states in a lot of the things that matter, and we get a chance to travel across the U.S. to talk about what Kentucky has done, even it being a high poverty state. As you see, we've increased degrees and credentials by 6.4%, which is amazing in many ways. And I want to be clear that, you know, this happens on our campuses. This is where the rubber meets the road, and I appreciate Senator Givens pointing that out. These gains were driven by substantial increases in undergraduate certificates and graduate degrees. When we first came into this work, I remember that we said we had all these middle-skilled jobs that were not getting filled, and we worked hard looking at the quality of those certificates and working with employers to make sure that they did. And we are doing a much better job. Even some legislation you folk passed in the last couple of years have helped us to really concentrate on those high impact areas that we are in need of, like healthcare, aviation, avionics, some of those other areas. And at CPE, we coordinate those events, if you will, to get us there. The undergraduate degrees and credentials awarded to low-income students up by 4.1%, and to our minority populations up 7.9%, one of the highest in the country. And these are important because, honestly, it's not a statement about P12 in any negative way, but the gaps are growing. And the more we get the students in our atmosphere on post-secondary campuses, we're going to have to work a little bit harder, even to make sure that they get that credential that they need in order to go into the workforce. I've told you about this already, but to give you an example with other states, you see Kentucky there in the red bar. I mean, many states are decreasing. Many haven't increased nearly as much. I'm proud to say that we're number 2 in the country in percent increase. That just didn't happen. If you look at, in the last, 2018 cohort, if you can see that, we've increased our 6-year completion rate by 2.8 percentage points. I mean, percent-wise, that's huge, right? From 59% to 62.2%. But I'm proud to say this, in getting to what Governor Patton said a long time ago, by 2020, we were not only not even close to the national average on anything, we were far from it. But now we just surpassed the national average on completion rate. So maybe not a big deal to some people, but it is to us, so I'm proud of that. And once again, once again, as I mentioned, we're now at 56.2% toward our 60 by 30 goal. I hope to surpass it with some of the new metrics that are in the performance funding model, like more low income and more adult learners. But we feel good that we're on the trajectory to get where we're going. And so I think that's the last slide. Mr. Chair, we are open to any questions that you may have of us.
Thank you, President Thompson, and your presenters. I know this is a lot of information to absorb, members. We do have some members that do have some questions. I do have a couple myself. I'll start with President Thompson. You were talking about the increase in the adult learner metric. How many adults do we have in Kentucky that have maybe some college credit but do not have a degree or certificate or a credential?
Great question. If you look at the total numbers, it's about 1.2 million, but that's not the way you have to look at it. You have to look at it based on age, populations. You have to look at what's the likelihood, where they're at in the process. So we're dealing with a little over 600,000, by the way, that will be in need of that credential. Even more that needs to have that skill up, if you will, in order to move up the system, because we become ever more a technological system. So that's even an area where we're looking at with those adult learners, working with employers, the chamber, and other folks to get them skilled up.
Thank you. We have some questions. Representative Decker.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your presentation. I have a couple of questions about the weights that you talked about. I think it's a lofty goal and a good incentive to have a performance-based outcome, but the weights are what trouble me. And I understand that the research institutions have a different mission, but I'm wondering if this model should include weights for them for such things as for the difference in missions, when, for example, I can think of, and I think I'm right, that there are at least 4 other ways that they receive funding. For example, they charge higher tuition for those degrees. They have research dollar funding. You mentioned one of you talked about the federal dollars that flow in for research. They have all kinds of grant opportunities because they are research institutions, and they receive higher base funding. So to include them in weights to make up for the differences and so that they don't lose funding, it seems like they have so many other avenues for funding. I don't see the purpose of the weights. And if you just do the numbers on the weighting, it looks like without the weights, UK would have received 6.8 million. Instead, they received 35.7 million. That's a big difference when they have all these other funding mechanisms because they are research institutions. Whereas U of L, it looks like, would have received 1.4 million in performance-based funding without weights, and yet they received 19.7 million. So I'm just curious, your thoughts, given those facts, how is it justifiable to give the research hospitals in a funding model those weights?
I'm going to answer your question, but I want to comment on one of the things you said, and that's about those research dollars. I would say in every case, at least 95% plus of the cases, those are restricted funds. So when a research institution receives a federal research grant, those dollars have to be spent on the research, and those are not dollars that can be used as operating funds. The other thing that I would say is that in a lot of ways it would have been patently unfair not to include the weightings in 2016 for the research institutions because of the differences in their missions and the differences in their cost structure. And I'm going to give you just one example of the difference in the cost structure. This is a recent 2023 AAUP survey of faculty salaries. And if you look at professors in the East South Central region, which is the region that Kentucky is in, professors at doctoral institutions are paid $142,000. Professors at master's degree granting institutions are paid a little over $92,000. That's a difference of 1.54 in terms of the multiple, in terms of that salary differential. And that salary differential is necessitated, as I said earlier, because UK and U of L compete in a national and international market for that faculty talent. And so they are paying higher salaries across the board, not only for their faculty, but also their administrators. And that's on the operating side of the equation. And so the weightings help to level the playing field between the research institutions and the comprehensive institutions in terms of that cost and mission differential.
I want to answer your question even more specifically to it. I don't know what those, I'm not familiar with the numbers you just used, so I won't comment on that, but a couple of points. I was one of those presidents sitting around the table back in 2016, and I honestly argued against the weights in the sense of the word because it didn't look good on me as a small institution at the time. However, the entire working group came with that consensus. One of the things I did argue for is a low-income metric, an underrepresented metric as an example, because that I knew we were serving those populations. So from my standpoint, whether it's, I think this is where the working group is so important because I keep telling people it's not a CPE model, it's the legislature's model, right? And we implement it. So from a standpoint of each institution as they represent what they need, I think that's exactly what you see in the working group. You have each of the institutions coming to the table, whether you're a comprehensive or a research institution that argues the things that they need in order to educate their students. So not sure I can answer whether it was fair or unfair, but at the time, the working group, and by the way, and the weights came in 2016, and so it's not been changed over those years except for this last time when we took the half weight on one particular metric, which was underrepresented But I think when you look at the differentials in weights, you will see money exchanging hands, absolutely.
And just quickly, just to say, I think to add to that, part of the decision was whether to put them all into one model or to separate them out. And obviously, if it had been separated, then comprehensive universities, between a research and comprehensive university model, then the comprehensive universities would never have been able to get any funding from the research institutions because it would have been in a separate pool, right? So I think in as part of the discussions in 2016 to put them together, it's like, well, how do we sort of approximate what we had historically given research institutions versus what we had historically given comprehensive universities to start the model with, considering we're going to all put them together, I think was part of the reasons why it was weighted that way. Because, again, we were considering all the funds running through the model and putting them into the same pool.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask another question?
One brief follow-up,
Okay, thank you.
Representative.
I appreciate that, but I don't understand still when they charge higher tuition and they get higher base funding for those very reasons that you stated, that it is still justifiable to give them such high weights. But I wanted to ask also, in one of your charts, and I can't find it again, I see that you have a small school adjustment. And I'm wondering why UK and U of L get a small school adjustment that increases their funding when shouldn't the smallest schools have the largest small school funding?
The small school adjustment is just within the comprehensive sector. There is an adjustment for UK and U of L. It does not increase their funding. It just allows them to reserve 10% of their base that does not run through the funding model. So it doesn't increase their funding. It just protects 10% of their dollars from running through the funding model, which is the same thing that happens with the comprehensive sector. And again, that was to maintain funding parity between the two sectors when you run the funding model. Because if you didn't do that, the model would immediately call for a shift of those dollars from the research sector to the comprehensive sector. And those were dollars that the two research institutions already had in their base due to their cost and mission differences. I would like to go back to your previous question about the weightings, because a lot of people don't understand this about the weightings. What drives this chart right here, your increases in your percent share of funding, is having the most metrics for which you achieve growth rates above the sector average. If you don't beat the sector average on a given metric, there's no way you can increase your share of funding. The weightings don't impact that growth in terms of the sector average. If an institution had 100 low-income degrees in year one, and then they increased it to 110 in year two, that's a 10% growth. Okay, let's weight that. You've got 200 weighted degrees in year one. Now you've got 220 weighted degrees in year two. Well, guess what? That's still 10% growth. So UK and U of L have to beat those above average growth rates in order to increase their share. And as you can see, the University of Louisville is one of the institutions that had the third largest decline in their percent share over this time period. So it's not the weightings per se, it's whether you achieve growth rates above the sector average that matter. And of course, it has not had a negative impact on Northern in terms of their increase over this time period.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Members, we have several members with questions. We do have some citizens who have signed up. So I'll just ask members, please be as concise as possible with your questions. Next, we have Vice Chair Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. Representative Decker actually hit on my question already, but I'm going to try to hit it from a different angle because I don't fully understand it, and so it's going to take some follow-up time for me, perhaps after the meeting. But Dr. Payne, you said the small school adjustment was intended to help smaller schools to compete with larger schools. Yet in the pool of around $50 million I'm seeing coming to the different universities across the state, UK got 17 million, U of L got 12 million. I think KSU got around 11 million, and the other $20 million will split up amongst all the other universities. So it's just not making sense to me if the goal is to help those smaller schools to compete with the larger schools. So can you help me to understand that just a little bit better?
Yes, and it gets back to that my answer to the previous question about, funding parity between the two sectors. If you're going to allow the comprehensive sector to set aside 10% in the aggregate of their funding, we had to set aside 10% for U of L and 10% for UK of their funding. That was not necessarily a small school adjustment. That was just to achieve funding parity within the model. Where the small school adjustment comes in is within that comprehensive sector within the funding model. We added up every 10% of every comprehensive university's allocable resources, took that and divided it by 6. So you had about a $4.5 million small school adjustment for each comprehensive university. Well, if you back out and protect $4.5 million out of KSU's base funding, that's about 20% of their allocable resources. It's only about 6% of Western's allocable resources. So we were allowing that small school adjustment among the comprehensive universities to protect a larger share of the base funding for KSU and Moorhead than for Eastern and Western. And that's why the model was designed where you take 10% of each comprehensive university's allocable resources, you get that sector total and divide by 6. And that's what provides that small school adjustment.
Increased it this year. For
Okay.
the other institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we have Representative Truitt.
Thank you, Chairman. Guys, I appreciate your all's presentation. And this is definitely new to me, but I love the numbers and the percentages and all those things. I'm a data guy. A lot of the questions that I had were kind of somewhat answered. So excuse my ignorance on this question here, but we talk about the different weights on research universities. So how does a university become a research university? Is that open to any university, or are there certain requirements? Because if I'm a university president and I'm going to get 1.6 if I'm a research university, but if I'm just a comprehensive university, I'm only going to get 1. I mean, I'm smart enough to know that, hey, I'll go with the research university. So what's preventing everybody from becoming research university?
What a great question. Several things, actually. I'll make it fast. First of all, it's in the 1997 House Bill 1 post-secondary reform that defined the research institutions, which was UK as the land-grant research, extensive institution, and Louisville as an urban research institution, if you will. That's one thing, but you just can't design it yourself. A Carnegie or Carnegie, whichever way you want to pronounce it. I'm from Eastern Kentucky, so I say Carnegie. They decide exactly, and it's based on extramural money, research, money that comes in. It's defined on how many PhD graduates, research graduates you put out. It's designed with all those things, so Carnegie designates those. They have designated UK as a research extensive and Louisville as a research extensive based on those two criteria, as well as the state law did the same thing. As you all know, there's a bill that may be filed this year that looks at allowing our institutions, comprehensives possibly, to offer PhDs. They can move toward that designation. It's not a CPE designation, I tell people, but it is a Carnegie designation that allows that to happen. But in order for that to happen, you have to change state law to allow even that to take place. Hopefully I'm concise in that explanation.
Thank you very much.
Our next question is from Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have I've got a myriad of questions. I need to follow up and probably come to CPE and have a more thorough conversation and a more thorough explanation of the presentation and the differences between the research institutions and the comprehensive institutions and how that funding is done. I see, and I've got a definition in here on a slide, on slide 27. And that explains the research and comprehensive universities, and that kind of thing. But I think there is some sense of not having or a sense of not understanding fully by comprehensives as to how the weights are taking place and how their funding is taking place and how can they move or what's happening. Is their funding fair in this model? And it seems like you all were dealing with what Solomon was trying to deal with, how to divide the baby. So it's very difficult as I see it, and I don't. I mean, it's going to take more time for me to understand fully, and more of what you all are doing or have done as it relates to other universities. I think there's a number of universities out there, comprehensive universities, that have an issue with this funding model. So I'd like to understand it better. So I think that's going to be a follow-up.
And I do want to address a piece of this. I mean, a lot of people think there's some misinformation that this is CPE's model, that we make those decisions. We don't. We follow the law. We actually distribute what we've been told and how we're told to do so. So there are a lot of discussions on whether or not the weighting's fair. And you're going to, based on what institution you're at, based on what argument that you have toward that. In CPE's case, we're agnostic, to be honest with you, because we're here to distribute the way it's designed, the way it's about. I have argued for my position for state, since I represent the state. I have argued for things at the Performance Funding Working Group that is designed to do things like increase the low-income metric, because I think it's good for the state, adult learner metric. But even the working group could have said, no, Thompson, we don't like your idea. We won't do that, right? So around the table, as Representative Tipton can say, we all have one voice, and we try to get to consensus with that, and that's what we give to you all that you put in law. So a part of this is, a lot of numbers to make it happen, and even explaining it doesn't really get to the assertion about whether it's fair or not fair, right? And so one of the things I'm surely not willing to do as an impartial coordinating board person here is to make a statement about whether I see it as fair or not fair. When I was president at the time at one of the institutions, I can tell you what I thought was good for me, right? And I argued that. I argued for a larger, smaller school adjustment as an example. So a lot of things, but was very much from the viewpoint of me operating a campus at the time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think on that point that Representative Brown makes up, all members, this is a lot of information to take in. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, reach out to CPE, reach out to myself, and we'll try and get you the answers to those questions. Our next question or comment comes from Representative Doan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Part of the discussion today, we talked about federal research dollars or federal funds that might flow into our state. President Trump recently did an executive order ending discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. As part of that executive order, he's requiring that a number of the universities comply with the Fair Admissions v. President of Fellows Harvard College Supreme Court case that came out. I know there was an Attorney General opinion last year on that issue. Could you tell us where our public universities are on those issues? How are they moving in towards understand that in terms of admissions, in terms of hiring? And then are we in jeopardy of potentially losing any federal funding as a result of those?
I'll let the attorney answer it fully, but I will say that I think we are we're in good shape, to be honest with you. One of the things that we did with a lot of discussions with you all over the last couple of years, the things that was seen as quote unquote not fair, that we've actually took action on, to be honest with you. The item that President Trump's executive order, I think in most cases, I think we'll be good on. Now, we haven't fully understood everything yet, to be honest with you. And the folk we have in D.C. that are talking to us haven't fully understood all those bits and pieces yet. So a more concrete answer I probably can't provide, but my clear, after I talk to presidents daily, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, I'll just add, obviously we don't know all the activities going on at all our institutions to know whether or not they'd be in compliance, but I can tell you, from an admissions perspective, our admissions rate for our institutions, most of them are in the 90%. So we're not using race in admissions, right, part of our process. we're viewing applications and making decisions, but most folks that apply get into our institutions, both obviously 2-year is open admissions, but even in our 4-year institutions. So race has never been something that's been used in admissions. And as far as, scholarship decisions potentially, once the Students for Fair Admissions case came out, I know a lot of institutions changed their practices, when the case came down a year and a half ago. So I know that's already been addressed. And I mean, race-based scholarships, even before Student for Fair Admissions, I know others that had been struck down by the U.S. Department of Education even before that decision came down. So I think we should be in good shape in that regard. As far as the individual activities on each campus, and hiring and that stuff, I know they were, a lot of them had federal EEO compliance offices that they had and things they had to do from the federal perspective. I know they're weighing what they need to do with that moving forward. But I know they're on it for sure. Obviously, they're not going to jeopardize losing those funds. And there's nothing that I'm aware of that we require at the state that would, not allow them to adjust.
Representative Bratcher.
Thank you, Chair Tipton. I just had a question on the metric after people graduate from college. Is there a metric to track where they're at and what pay scale or range they're in given their degrees?
There's not, but we have data that we look at all the time in that particular area. One of the other metrics that I'm interested in down the road, just to throw it in, is what I call a quality metric. How well, and Kentucky's closer to defining that in a quantitative manner more than any other state. That is, are we incorporating enough of those employability skills that, that's my argument, should be the idea of what quality is. If business and industry and others want to hire your student based on their ability not only to perform the technical task, but also those other tasks that they say we haven't done a good job in doing over the years, that's a good idea of quality. But no, sir, we don't have a metric that follows afterwards. That would be a longitudinal metric, actually, right? And you'll have to define exactly how many years that you're looking at, what sort of average salary, as an example, you think they should be making, and how to do that. One of the things we're going to be launching at 10 o'clock is this futurity, and it's more information than you ask for, that allows us to look at all of those items. The first state to do this. That every student, all of you, can look at exactly what jobs are out there for these majors, how much it pays, where it goes, all these pieces. So we have the capabilities of doing
it. We're tracking it. It's just not in the performance model. But we are looking at those outcomes for sure.
Our next question will be from Representative Grossell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question today is, how does performance funding reward efficiency? It seems to me that we're awarding performance-based funding on a higher cost structure, and shouldn't we ensure that universities are offering quality programs at the lowest possible cost to students and taxpayers?
I'll let Bill go in greater detail mechanically, but you have to understand the performance funding model only looks at several items, but we have also the CPE, the way we measure all of those items, we have a whole nother set of metrics. For an example, we look at unmet need, how well the institutions are providing students that need the help the most. That's an example of it, and our institutions are giving more money than both state and federal aid put together. We also look at other efficiency measures. In the performance funding model, they look at square footage as an example, to degree and so on. But Bill, I'll let you.
Do you have a comment on that? I would just say, 70% of the model is outcomes based. So if you're able to produce those outcomes at a lower cost, that's the incentive, I think, for it to be more efficient, right? We do look at some things like square footage and that sort of thing to approximate, fixed costs and that sort of thing. But if you're able to produce at a lesser cost, that's, it encourages institutions to be more efficient in that production.
And I'll add to this as well. Between 2008 and about 2021, the post-secondary education system experienced 11 budget cuts over 13 years. During that same time period, starting around 2009-10, the council took back responsibility for setting or determining tuition at our post-secondary institution organizations. and they started setting tuition and fee caps. And especially since President Thompson has come on board, we've kept those tuition and fee increases on average below 2% increase per year. That combination of, budget cuts historically, and it took a while for Kentucky to start reinvesting in post-secondary education, but then also constricting the amount of revenue that the institutions can generate through tuition and fee increases has resulted in a decline over time in what we call education and related spending, which is the metric that we use to track campus spending. And so you're seeing over time, consistently, over about a 6 or 7 year period, decreases in the amount of spending to educate students. And so they have had no choice, our institutions have had no choice but to become more efficient over this time period.
Our last question from members goes to Representative Banton.
Thank you. I was just wondering, is there any way that you could provide the committee with the number of 4-year and 2-year degrees and what those degrees are in? It's purely nosy. So
Yeah, sure.
We can do it. As a matter of fact, you can get on our website. We have one of the best data systems in the nation. I'll brag about those. You can see it all. But we'll be happy to. We'll get it to you. And you won't
if you could send me that link, just so for expediency, that would be beautiful.
Would you like it by institution or
that
overall?
would be lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
President Thompson, Travis, and Dr. Payne, appreciate you being here this morning. I know this is a lot of in-depth information, and I promise the members there will not be a quiz next week. Okay, we do have some citizens who have signed up to speak. First is Michael Frazier.
Mr. Chair, I'll probably have to leave before
Sure.
10, so my staff will be here if there's more questions.
Absolutely, thank you. Michael, if you please come up to the table, identify yourself for the record, and I will swear you in.
Wonderful. Good morning. My name is Michael Frazier. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Student Rights Coalition.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please proceed, Michael, and if you could be as brief as possible.
I will try my best, but as the Eastern Kentucky, and I have a gift to gab. So, folks, I'm excited to be here today to talk about this important model that's impacting Kentucky students and all who attend our post-secondary institutions. Now, when we talk about performance funding, Senator Givens has done an incredible job with the Council on Post-Secondary Education of trying to bring accountability, meeting the road with Kentucky taxpayer money. And I think that that's key, that when we talk about the legislature transferring its constitutional spending power to an executive agency, which is performance funding, that we're talking about how are we serving Kentucky taxpayer money and how are we ensuring that we keep our institutions accountable to the goals, to the education gaps, and to the disparities that are impacting Kentucky students. So we've heard a lot today when we discuss education performance, outcomes, and particularly I use enrollment because as the Council for Post-Secondary Education has told us in their 2023 performance review on page 11 to be specific, that enrollment is the leading trend when it comes to predicting degree attainability, and then also if we're going to see them continue within retention at our post-secondary institutions. And so when we look at performance funding that's been around for a little bit, let's talk about the quality outcomes, right? Let's talk about the 20.74% decline in enrollment in Kentucky's low-income black female students, the negative 0.47% decline in enrollment in Kentucky's low-income black male students, the 39.5% decline in enrollment in Kentucky low-income students generally across the board, the 11.4% decline in enrollment in Kentucky low-income underrepresented minority students, the 11.8% decline in enrollment of adult non-traditional students, the 53.26% decline of Kentucky low-income Native American students, the 23.23% decline of enrollment of Kentucky low-income black and biracial students, and the 36.95% decline in enrollment in Kentucky low-income black students in general. And this is, of course, in the face of a total enrollment loss when we look at Kentucky students in general. Now, that should sound a little contradictory from what we've heard, right? Now, we have seen stagnation to a
small increase of overall enrollment, but that includes both residential and non-resident students. When we look at Kentucky performance funding and how we assess if Kentucky performance funding is working, I'm not going to provide many answers, but I want to provide some questions that we should be asking. One, what are we measuring? Because we have to be persnickety with our words here. We do have a performance model that does success based upon degree output and credentialing. And we do have a success model that does account for enrollment as well. But when we look at the holistic picture of performance funding, as established in KRS 164.092, that's the TEL, and the details established in 13 KAR 2.120 for the four-year post-secondary institutions, 13 KAR 0.2130 for KCTCS, and then 13 KAR 2.160 for the student success outputs. These are the details that we need to start looking at. Is performance funding gearing towards Kentucky's low-income and underserved students? Are we really providing those wraparound services? And based upon the enrollment numbers, I see some great progress, especially led by Dr. Aaron Thompson and also Senator Gibbons, especially with SB 191 and also Chairman Tipton as well. We see some great progress of tweaking the performance funding model to ensure that we are taking Kentucky's taxpayer funding and measuring the right outcomes that we can. So the first question that I would pose to you all is that, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring Kentucky students with Kentucky's taxpayer money? The answer, if I may provide one, is that we can do better. We can do better, particularly when we get into those wraparound services, to ensure that we're funding that staff in a holistic way for our post-secondary institutions, to ensure that homeless students are being well kept, that we're funding the unfunded mandate for universities to take foster care students. And then something that we haven't even addressed in performance funding is children dealing with one in four kids, particularly in rural Kentucky, having a parent in jail. So what are we measuring and how are we directing those money? Two, what is the purpose of performance funding? Should we keep it as a degree output, or should we do it specifically based upon the needs and disparities of Kentucky students? Based upon the enrollment numbers, also a decline in FAFSA completions, and the fact that we do have a workforce that are sitting at home. One variable alone, correlation doesn't equal causation, but when we take the holistic picture of how Kentucky higher education, particularly for Kentuckians, are on a decline, I think that we have to better assess what is the purpose of performance funding and how it's impacting Kentuckians. And then the third thing, are our metrics fair? We've heard some questions here as to, are we funding our comprehensives and in a fair manner? And we're not trying to gang up upon the University of Kentucky or the University of Louisville. We want them to succeed because, their research and their mission statements are different. And they also serve Kentucky in wonderful and glorious purposes that we need them to succeed for. But when you look at the enrollment base of our comprehensives, if you want to talk about the kids that can't afford UK and U of L, if we want to talk about the kids that are disproportionately of the underserved populations in Kentucky, they're not going to the research institutions because affordability is the number one issue. They're going to the comprehensives. So when we look at the metrics, we have to ask ourselves, are we looking at these in a fair way? So I do ask you all, when you look at the TEL set up in performance funding and the details set in administrative regulation and how we're defining and qualifying that student success model, I do ask for you all to keep in mind to differentiate and choose your words well to ensure that Kentucky taxpayers' money is going to helping Kentucky students, because that's what we're here today. And based upon the qualification and the needs, especially in our workforce, given the future of higher education after this year facing an apocalyptic trend, we have to start being more persnickety in how we're funding our institutions and ensuring that they're meeting substantial qualitative needs that are disproportionately impacting Kentucky students. So I don't want to be duplicitous, but I do raise those three questions, and I think that you all should raise those questions too. And I appreciate you, and I'm open up for questions.
Any member have a brief question?
Mr. Chairman, may I be recognized?
Yes, Representative Grauson.
Thank you. Mr. Frazier, in your opinion, is this funding model helping Kentucky's underserved and low-income students?
No, it's not. And that's not based upon good effort and also trying and a deep desire. And I'm hopeful after some of the great efforts by the Council on Post-Secondary Education, and then I know innately the heart of Senator Givens and also Chairman Tipton, we're fine-tuning performance funding. And I think that that's what we need to be looking at the lens here is that based upon the needs of Kentucky and also the continuing evolution of the demands of the Kentucky student, that we're seeing the performance funding model evolve and grow. I mean, we saw an increase in low income. We also saw non-traditional students added to the performance funding model. We also saw the Council on Post-Secondary Education reform under 13 KAR 2.160, which described the details of how we're serving Kentucky's most needy students, if I could put it that way. But I think that as a committee, we can do committee providing oversight. It can be done better, and we can have intentionality, especially upon Kentucky's disparate needs, that provides disproportionate impacts upon education gaps, particularly rural and black students in Kentucky, that we can ask better questions, more targeted questions, especially promoting intersectionalities within these metrics. And that's something that's so important, is that when we look at the volume-based metric, it's not missing it's missing the details and the lives in which Kentucky students are facing. We're having students, and we have students who are willing to sleep in their car because we have sold them the dream of higher education can separate you from poverty. We know that. That's a fact. We have students that are willing to go hungry on our campuses so that they can be able to get their degree programs, because they're trying to escape either generational poverty, abuse at home, or trying to build a better future for their family. We know that they're willing to do what they're taking, but I would argue that the funding model hasn't really captured that life, the lives of how Kentuckians, the new Kentuckians, are facing higher education today.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you,
ma'am.
Michael. We have one more individual who's signed up to speak. Have Reverend A.D., is it Malone? Or Malore? Reverend A.D. Malone or Malore? Okay, apparently they had already left. Members, thank you so much for your participation today. I want to thank all the presenters. We will be meeting next Tuesday, and my plan is for us to hear legislation next week. So meeting's adjourned.